We are all pleased to welcome Stephen Aron, who is the Calvin and Marilyn Gross Director and President and CEO of the Autry Museum of the American West and Professor of History Emeritus at the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Aron assumed leadership of the Autry Museum in 2021 after a 3-decade career as a professor. Dr. Aron is the author of How the West Was Lost, The Transformation of Kentucky from Daniel Boone to Henry Clay, American Confluence, The Missouri Frontier from Borderland to Border State, The American West, A Very Short Introduction, and Peace and Friendship, An Alternative History of the American West. He's also the co-author of Worlds Together, Worlds Apart, A History of the World from the Beginning of Humankind to the Present, sorry about that, and co-editor of Trading Cultures, The Worlds of Western Merchants, and the past editor of Convergence magazine. And as Carrie indicated, some of the books are for purchase after the event, and Dr. Aron has graciously agreed to sign copies for you. Dr. Aron holds degrees from Amherst College and the University of California, Berkeley. After completing his doctorate, he joined the faculty at Princeton University before moving to UCLA in 1996. And then from 2002 to 2012, Dr. Aron split his appointment between UCLA and the Autry Museum of the American West. At the Autry, he served as the founding executive director and then chair of the Institute for the Study of the American West. In that position, as well as his role as consultant for other museums and for numerous television programs, documentaries, and films, he has sought to bridge the divide between academic and public history. More recently, Dr. Aron advised and appeared in Kevin Costner's West, an 8-part series that recently aired on the History Channel. In 2011, Stephen Aron was elected to the American Antiquarian Society, and in 2015, the Society of American Historians. In 2017, he served as president of the Western History Association. So please help me welcome Dr. Stephen Aron.
Thank you all so much for coming this evening. It's really an honor to be here. I guess I should say something about my title. I'm a sucker for alliteration, and this one I got a little away from me. But there is a symmetry to the lecture because it's got 4 R words, and there are 4 parts to this lecture. So first, I'm going to talk about I want to talk a little bit of review about what we know about removal and not what we know about removal in Missouri and how we speak about it. Second, I'll take up the topic of reparations. That is, what has been done and not done to redress the losses suffered by those who were removed from Missouri and elsewhere. And third, I turn to repatriation, which once was entwined with reparations as it involved the return of people to the lands from which they were displaced, or that's the original meaning that the term held. Now, however, repatriation, at least for people who hold my position, refers to the return of things from the collections of museums to the native communities from which they presumably originated. And then fourth and finally, I want to suggest the role that repatriation can play in fostering a reconciliation between museums and native communities. So let me start then with the first R word, and that is removal. Now, if you ask most Americans to think about removal, they would go immediately to the paradigmatic experience being people. That was the easy question of the night. They go to the Trail of Tears. And most then know that this involved the Cherokees and the trail that was a forced migration from Georgia to Oklahoma. And along the way, the Cherokees suffered hardships and deaths, which continued after they arrived at their new homes with inadequate supplies to sustain them. For its part, the state of Missouri has signaled the significance of this removal by marking the Trail of Tears through the state and establishing a park, the Trail of Tears State Park, at the point along the Mississippi, I should say, where the Cherokees first crossed into the Missouri on their way to their new homelands west of the state. As in many treaties between the United States and Indian nations, the pact with the Cherokees promised the new lands to the removed peoples, quote, as long as the grass shall grow and the rivers run, a duration that the United States government declared over before the end of the 19th century. Pressed further about the history of Indian removal, Americans, or at least my former students at UCLA, will let them be stand-ins for all Americans, might also then next refer to the removal of the so-called 5 civilized tribes, of which the Cherokees were one, joined in the evictions and coerced transfers of land by the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, the Creeks, and the Seminoles, all in the 1830s. Now, if I had more time, I would sort of push forward on a call for a broader and deeper history of removals, one which looks beyond the Trail of Tears, beyond the so-called 5 civilized tribes, and beyond the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Broadening and deepening popular understanding would be valuable because removal was the tragic common denominator of American Indian experiences across the continent, from the beginnings of the American Republic through the 19th century, and in some cases even beyond that. I'll settle, though, for 2 more modest aims in this quadrant of my lecture. First is to remind Missourians that removals, and those of you who came to my talk this morning to the Lewis and Clark Trail Alliance, this is one of the things I highlighted there, is to remind Missourians that removals didn't just go through Missouri, as the Trail of Tears State Park would suggest. They also were from Missouri. That is, there were plenty of Indians in Missouri who were removed from Missouri as part of the same overall process. And second for this part is to rid our textbooks and our historical monuments and the markers that accompany them of the euphemism that is removal. Now, I have in the front row here several people who accompanied me to Fort Osage this afternoon, which was an instructive trip. How many of you have been out there? Oh, look at that. See, now I asked that question, by the way, and this morning I actually asked the question, just how many of you have been to the Autry Museum? 2? 3? We've got to do better than that. Anyway, Fort Osage was a fascinating site, and I can talk more about it in the Q&A if people want, but I think it does make a good starting point for talking about removals from Missouri. That visit took us to the site where in 1808, William Clark negotiated the first of what turned out to be many treaties with Indians in Missouri and far beyond Missouri. In many respects, the 1808 treaty with the Osages set the pattern for the ones that followed. Its terms compelled the Indian nation, in this case the Osage, to give up land in exchange for promised goods and, quote, protection by the United States. Though as it turned out, what the Osages and other Indian nations really needed was not protection by the United States so much as protection from the United States. And though this treaty prefigured what was to come, the 1808 treaty with the Osages and the ways in which the negotiations were accomplished over the objections of many Osages weighed heavily on Clark's conscience, so much so that he later acknowledged he might be damned hereafter for that treaty, though it was interesting, Jay, and I don't think I missed that. There was no reference to that at in the museum that accompanies, or the monuments that accompany that site at Fort Osage. Clark's misgivings about the 1808 treaty with the Osages and with other land cessions he wrested from Indians were not shared by the majority of Americans who migrated to Missouri after the War of 1812. Once peace opened the floodgates, tens of thousands of migrants from the eastern United States poured into Missouri. These newcomers had no interest in peace, friendship, or trade with Indians. They wanted only the lands of Indians. That meant native claims needed to be extinguished and Indian inhabitants exterminated, or at the very least, evicted. The shift in demography and the rise of democracy, or more specifically, white man's democracy, abetted the ambitions of white American colonists and enabled the expulsions of Indians from this state. Now, a variety of rationales buttressed campaigns for Indian removal, and in many ways, the ones that you hear about Indian removal in Missouri sound very much like the more famous ones that accompany the Cherokee removal on the Trail of Tears. The Missouri Territorial Assembly, for example, insisted that the grants to Indians were never meant to be permanent. The grants from the Spanish government, Spanish colonial government, were never meant to be permanent. That scattered parts of Indian tribes were never meant to hold much lands, if any. Better, the state legislature or the territorial legislature asserted to relocate the Indians away from Missouri so that to some remote part which is better suited to Indian pursuits. Some advocates for Indian removal blamed Indians for violence that occurred between white squatters and native inhabitants. Other times they maintained eviction protected them from assaults from those same white inhabitants. The bottom line, acknowledged one representative, was the tracts held by Indians were too valuable to remain in the hands of Indians. Similarly blunt was the comment of Senator Thomas Hart Benton, who said, quote, "To remove the Indians would make room for the spread of slaves." Indian leaders, for their part in Missouri, disputed the various justifications for their expulsion. They were not, they claimed, the meandering hunters they were caricatured to be. They presented themselves as having done sort of all the things. And again, you see the same commentary a decade later in the Cherokee protests against their removal, but you see it first in Missouri. During the War of 1812, many Indians here claimed, especially the Shawnees and Delawares, claimed that they had been on good terms, remained peacefully in neighborly relationships with their American neighbors. So why compel them to leave? Compelling argument. But in Missouri, might trumped right during the 1820s. The will of the majority of voters expressed itself clearly in the election of the state's first governor in 1820. William Clark, who was territorial governor, had tried to safeguard the claims of Shawnee and Delaware Indians in particular, was overwhelmingly defeated by an opponent who accused him of being too good to Indians. Ensuing elections delivered the same message to elected officials in Missouri. Missouri voters wanted Indians out without distinction for the timing of their migrations, the origin of their claims, their history of peaceful and friendly relations with Indians, or their progress as farmers and herders. The decade saw a series of treaties in which Missouri Indians exchanged their lands for acreage to the west of the state. As superintendent of Indian Affairs, who negotiated and oversaw the making of these treaties, William Clark was also charged with managing the removal of Indians from the state. While Clark, it should be said, accommodated the Democratic tide by compelling Missouri's Indians to cede lands and be exiled, he continued to voice some reservations, if not about the rightness of removals, then at least about the ways in which the migrations out of the state were handled. That was not true, or not so, for most white Missourians who cheered the deportations and voted to make them happen. The cheering, I think we can now agree, long ago stopped. The rationales offered for removals have been undercut. And yet, we still put a benign face on these dispossessions and forced migrations by using that term, removal. Yes, it's the word that did appear in the original debates, in the original sources. But even during the congressional debates over the Indian Removal Act, dissenters raised objections to the term. Removal, and I'm quoting here from Edward Everett, a representative from the state of Massachusetts, removal, he declared, is a soft word. And soft words, he said, are delusive. Removal removes the coercion and violence and creates confusion about who was removing whom. We might conclude that Indians chose removal for themselves, if you sort of just read some of the ways in which it's put forward. To avoid delusive understandings, I would argue that we should excise removals from our current textbooks and from our monument markers. In recent years, historians have started to do just that, replacing removals often with expulsions, a term that was used in the age of Jackson by the policy's opponents and by the policy's victims. Scholars have also turned to terms coined much later to convey a true impression of the impact of state-sponsored expulsions. From the 1990s came ethnic cleansing. Current headlines suggest that deportation is an appropriate substitute for removal. Speak of expulsions, ethnic cleansings, and deportations puts the removals of American Indians from Missouri and through Missouri and elsewhere in the United States in uncomfortable company. Indeed, a case can be made that many subsequent state-sponsored deportations learned from the U.S. example. In the 19th century, French, Russian, and German imperialists all referenced American expulsion and expansion as a model to be emulated. In the 20th century, Nazis likened the quest for Lebensraum in Eastern Europe to the settlement of the Western United States. And Hitler famously held that, quote, the Volga must be our Mississippi, with indigenous inhabitants west of the Volga to be exterminated or deported east of it. Now, in a few of those subsequent cases, the instigators of expulsions and exterminations have offered various forms of restitution to the descendants of the dispossessed and the disappeared. Which brings me to my second R, reparation. Americans, on the other hand, only slowly recognized and have never really, I think, completely reckoned with the legacy of removals. In the 19th century, so-called Friends of the Indians opposed wars of extermination, but still waged wars against Indian cultures. Saving Indians meant converting them to Christianity and from their outmoded ways, which included separating them from their traditions of communal landholding. The signal legislative achievement of these campaigns, the Dawes Act of 1887, aimed to break up reservations into individuated homesteads. By the time this policy was reversed in the 1930s, Native peoples had lost 2/3 of the lands they had possessed before allotment. After the Second World War, the United States government established the Indian Claims Commission with the intention of making good on the promises in the treaties that had been signed with Indian nations. Unfortunately for Indians, the monetary settlements that resulted hardly compensated for all the acreage that had been surrendered in treaties and then through sales after the Dawes Act. In the 21st century, in the late 20th century and the 21st century, acknowledgments of the wrongs done to Indians and of their rights have advanced, at least rhetorically. Material redress, however, has been much slower to come. Approaching 200 years now after the treaties that compelled their dispossession from Missouri and their deportation from the state, Missouri's former indigenous inhabitants still await meaningful recompense. Now, at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, I think you saw glimpses of possibilities of campaigns for reparations making headway around the globe. Around the world, we saw governments grappling with the legacies of slavery, of imperialism, and internal colonialism. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, most famously in South Africa, were established. Statues were toppled. apologies were issued and efforts at restitution were undertaken in various parts of the globe. A populist backlash, however, has dimmed hopes for reparations. Actually, let me hold this one for a second. Has dimmed hopes for reparations. In the United States, as we all know, Donald Trump's second term has brought the return of Confederate names to U.S. military bases and efforts to eradicate woke history. In the name of restoring truth and sanity, executive orders have sought to cleanse museum exhibitions, national parks, and school curricula of divisive concept, which in practice means wiping away the experiences of various peoples and some of the damages many suffered. Instead, most recently, and this sort of was particularly important at the Autry, most recently the Department of Homeland Security pushed out John Gast's American Progress. The original of this painting is at the Autry Museum, on its social media channels, and claimed it as an accurate depiction of American expansion, one in which Indians vanished peacefully, making way for the parade of pioneers and the progress of American civilization. And the DHS captioned it, "A heritage to be proud of, a homeland worth defending." There's a lot to be said, and I've said a lot of things in various media outlets recently, including an article in the New York Times last week. But I would say what's clear to me is in this sanitized version of American history, reparations are not on the table. Now, what I would say, maybe too cynically here, is what American Indians have gotten instead of land reparations are land acknowledgments, which I was surprised this program did not begin with. But I'll come back to that in a second. These are the statements that now customarily open programs at universities and many museums, and in some places even government proceedings, at least in California. The formula that land acknowledgments follow typically recognize, honor, and give thanks to former native caretakers of a region, as well as their ancestors, elders, and future generations. And in fact, many Kansas City institutions proclaim their land acknowledgments on their websites. You can look at the ones up for the Kansas City Public Schools, for the Nelson Atkins Museum, for the KC Rep, for the, let's see who else, the Library of the University of Missouri, Kansas City, which not only has its land acknowledgement, but actually has a helpful guide to how to write a land acknowledgement on its website. Now, detractors have grown skeptical about land acknowledgments as these have proliferated. In practice, say critics, the rote incantations of formulaic statements amount to, quote, moral exhibitionism. That is, land acknowledgments are what you give when you're not going to give land back. They offer acknowledgments and respects, but no tangible reparation. Now, I guess it's easy to become cynical about land acknowledgments, but I do think actually they are a starting point to open the way for more meaningful conversations and maybe more meaningful actions. And I would argue, at least in the case of the state of Missouri, that official acknowledgments might start by recognizing, by commemorating, and monumentalizing the fuller history of deportations, not just through Missouri, but from Missouri. Now, I have no illusions about my power as a historian to effectuate monetary reparations, to arrange the repatriation of Indians back onto their former lands, or even to get new monuments and plaques erected at historic sites. But as the director of the Autry Museum, I can facilitate the repatriation of native art and artifacts. The Autry took a step, I think, in that direction with the adoption of a native collection policy, of which I'll talk about more, in 2022, in many ways that anticipated the changes that we've now seen nationally in the 2024 revisions to the Native Americans Graves and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, which the original dating from 1990. The new policy from the federal government, to the extent that it's in place now, advantages native knowledge and advances repatriations. Yet I would argue the process should not be viewed as a zero-sum game. Done in the proper spirit, repatriation abets a commitment to collaboration and consultation that I would argue also advantages museums by advancing their ability to tell Native stories and by allowing them to reset their relations with Native communities. Now, partnership historically played little part in the history of museums and Indigenous peoples. Museums know best was the prevailing ethos. Once items entered museum collections, Native communities, Native peoples usually lost any voice in how the objects were treated, exhibited, and interpreted. In fact, I sort of like to say, the sort of historic relationship was museums here, Native communities here, or really actually museums here, Native communities here, because once the collection went into museum hands, Natives sort of were out of the picture in terms of any sort of curatorial or collection or conservation decisions. But as I said, I think that is changing, and repatriation is part of that. Getting things back, as I said at the beginning of my lecture, getting things back from museums was not what repatriation originally meant. Until the 1980s, the term was reserved for the return of peoples to their homelands. Even human remains that had been plundered from graves were deemed too important to science to be returned. No wonder Native people harbored deep resentments towards museums and pushed to decolonize them. In the United States, as I mentioned, the passage of the Native Americans Graves and Repatriation Act in 1990, and then the subsequent opening of the National Museum of the American Indian in 2004 marked important turning points. The former made the repatriation of Native American cultural items, including human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony, a matter of national law. The latter put a museum on the Mall in Washington, D.C. that privileged Native knowledge. The Autry's Native Collection Policy 2022 emulates, it seems to me, the spirit and substance that animated NAGPRA and NMAI. In addition to adherence to repatriation law, the policy commits the Autry to consulting and collaborating with Native nations and Indigenous communities on the interpretation, management, access, and care of Native collections. It identifies these items to be the living cultural representatives of Native nations and Indigenous communities from which they emanate. As such, instructions and directives from these communities inform the interactions that Autry staff have with these materials. The aim is to augment understanding of the knowledge, histories, and lives that each item holds, as well as to create exhibitions, programs, and educational projects together. National policy now aligns with the Autry's collections policy. In 2024, the Interior Department revised NAGPRA in ways that tipped the scale toward Native claimants. Under the revised regulations, Native sources once ignored are given primacy over museum records in making determinations about what should be repatriated, and what can or cannot be put on display. Too early to tell whether those 2024 revisions are going to work the way as intended. It's quite possible that the Trump administration will rescind them once they discover that it was a Biden initiative. Or, it seems to me, the courts may well overturn them on the grounds of administrative overreach, that this should have been congressionally authorized in the way that NAGPRA 1990 originally was. And it's also possible that museums, in many cases, some have created exhibitions, programs, and projects in collaboration with Native communities, but some have also stuck to traditional curatorial practices, and some of more legal importance have filibustered or have resisted, have opposed embracing repatriation. Now, museum leaders have offered a variety of rationales for resisting repatriation. Let me touch on 4. First, both domestically and internationally, where NAGPRA does not apply, my peers in the museum world have maintained that because of migrations, the nation or community making claims is not related to the historical or ancient creator. Indeed, and Diane mentioned this in the introduction, as the co-author of a world history textbook, I can sort of say that the history of the world is the history of migrations. And so it's very easy, and certainly the history of Missouri is very much shaped by the history of migrations, by the history of the mixing and mingling of peoples. And in that context, it's often very hard to say who was the appropriate patria to which objects should be returned, especially as one goes deeper and deeper in time. Second, among the museum objections, is this sort of notion of museums know best. That is the oft-cited concern that natives to whom objects are repatriated do not have the resources to preserve or protect them. Museums exist, after all, to safeguard and exhibit the arts of the world and the cultural histories imbued in them. Deprived of the care of professional conservators and the carefully monitored conditions in museums, artwork would deteriorate, or worse, would be lost forever. The third rationale summons a museum director's nightmare. Native claimants utilize the power afforded by the new regulations and hollow out museum collections or rob them of their most precious pieces. And finally, museums argue that against the privatization of collections. Returning is taking objects from the public and putting them into private hands, indigenous hands. Downplaying their own ownership of collections, museum leaders and their allies base their opposition on the grounds that culture belongs to all and not just the offspring of its creators. Instead of surrendering to biological essentialism, the term is Stephen Kahn's, museum advocates sort of argue in terms of the cultural commons or in terms of cosmopolitanism as a museum aspiration. Native Americans, for their part, vigorously dispute these rationales, much as they did the earlier justifications for removal. They insist on the continuity of their lineages and on their enduring connections to former homelands. They disdain the paternalism of museum leaders and proclaim an expertise that transcends museum conservation codes. They also insist on the right to use the objects as they were intended in rites and rituals that, yes, may result in the deterioration in terms of the long-term life of the object, but this was what the purpose of the object was. And as for museums being plundered, Native claimants insist that those fears are overblown, but at the same time insist that items subject to repatriation should have never been in museums in the first place, as they were excavated from graves or improperly sold. And if culture can't be owned, then why do museums insist on preserving their exclusive ownership? So, where do I stand? I'm conflicted, at least on a few things. I believe in the mandate of museums to show art from around the world to the public and to slow its aging for the benefit of posterity. I concede also that repatriations enter a murky legal area when claims of cultural patrimony extend to purchased items, particularly ones sold by the artist or the descendant of the artist. I'm not a lawyer, however. I'm proud to say I'm not a lawyer. But before I became a museum director, I was and am a historian. And as a historian, I reject the notion that only the genetic descendants of people can unlock the keys to ancestral histories and cultures. And because, as I said, I'm attentive to the history of migrations, both globally and here, I recognize the challenges of establishing ties between lands, peoples, and objects, the more distant times especially. All of which, as I say, puts me in a position of sometimes maybe leaning towards some kind of resistance to repatriation, at least at its most extreme. And yet, go back to where I started this lecture, The history of removals, the history of deportations, weighs heavily on my historical conscience. And righting those wrongs, it seems to me, outweighs the museum director's impulse to minimize legal obligations and maximize museum collections. In this conviction, I follow Rick West, W. Richard West, Jr., the person I succeeded at the helm of the Autry Museum. West is a lawyer, and proud of it, as well as a citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes and a peace chief of the Southern Cheyenne. After many decades working as an attorney, he moved into the museum world, serving as the founding director of the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., and later as the president and CEO of the Autry. In these roles, he championed a view of repatriation that looked beyond the law and advocated for voluntary returns of cultural objects and materials to Native communities. Repatriation, he insisted, is of paramount importance because it brings ancestral creations back home, reuniting them with the people to whom they rightfully belong. And more than just a return of things, repatriation is an act of restorative justice, a step toward healing, and an effort to support living Native cultures and secure a Native future. And actually, Philip Newfield, who's sitting right there, pointed me to this book, which I recommend to everyone, which presents a case study of how I think repatriation can work. I'll skip the details here, other than to say it really, I think, emphasizes at the end of the process the way in which the repatriation healed the Native community to which these objects, which had been taken hundreds of years ago, were returned to. Which brings me to my fourth R and final R, reconciliation. Rick West rests his case for voluntary repatriation as a form of reparation to Native peoples and as a means of recuperation and restoration. See how many R words I can do? For their communities. Indeed, here's one more. Indeed, before it was renamed and given the acronym NAGPRA, the federal repatriation legislation was titled the Bridge to Respect Act. And much bridging was needed, as I've argued, for Indians long felt disrespected by Indians for whom that displayed their ancestral creations and ancestral relations with no outreach to descendants. For repatriation, as that NAGPRA case study details, can convey respect and help restore, to make whole what has been smashed, to renew and revitalize. My larger point is not just, though, that Native communities' wounds are mended by sending objects back to them. Museums, I would argue, are also healed when they dispense with items that should not have been collected, and even more when they embrace a collaborative and cooperative repatriation process. Viewed this way, repatriation is the means to more than one end. Yes, its primary purpose is to return objects to Native communities of origin and enhance the well-being of those communities. In the process, however, repatriation can build trust between museums and those communities. With trust earned through generous returns, museums can forge a new compact with Native peoples built on mutual respect, shared stewardship, and joint exhibition making. Reconciliation, as I've also earlier emphasized, requires reckoning with removals. That process, I've argued, begins with removing that euphemism from our textbooks and from our historical markers. Let's start calling the displacement of Indians from Missouri what it was: a state-sponsored ethnic cleansing and a series of coerced mass deportations. Further, in acknowledging that we inhabit lands that once belonged to Native peoples, let's move beyond the minimal recognition offered by land acknowledgments. At this political juncture, meaningful reparations, whether monetary compensation or giving back land, seem a distant possibility. As a museum director, however, collection policies and repatriations are within my purview. I don't pretend that the return of items from museum collections will solve all problems, but they are significant to the future of museum communities. As important, they matter to the future of museums. Repatriation, as I've emphasized, opens the possibility through which we can construct a new relationship between museums and Native communities, not this, but this, can begin to repair the painful legacies of removal and lay the foundations for peace and friendship. Peace and Friendship is the title of my most recent book. Shameless plug. There, I looked at episodes in the history of American westward expansion in which erstwhile enemies overcame their differences, at least for a while. To be sure, the peace and friendship that happened in Missouri, several of the chapters focus on Missouri, and other American frontiers were not manifestations of a kind of kumbaya moment on the frontier. The accommodations that made for amicable relations were generally unstable, and I can talk about all the reasons why they fell apart. But when I originally conceived the book that became Peace and Friendship, I envisioned the alternative history, that is the focus of the book, reaching from the American Revolution to the present. But when I left my position at UCLA and accepted the directorship at the Autry, I realized my time for research and writing would be drastically curtailed. Bowing to this new reality, I decided to scale back the book's scope to the first century after American independence and publish it with the truncated chronology. I did, though, have a number of chapters on the board about the 20th century on the drawing board, but I never figured out, I never determined what the final chapter should be. I think maybe my work on repatriation at the Autry Museum has given me a fitting finale. Maybe when I leave the Autry and return to the search for peace and friendship, when I complete the second volume of the book, the history of repatriations from museums to Native communities will serve as that fitting last chapter. And I hope it will not end like earlier chapters in the book. In those chapters, common ground was found and lost. I hope that won't be the case for museums and Native communities. Instead, let's aspire to make the relationship between museums and Native communities a model of reconciliation, one worthy of acknowledgement and emulation. Thank you.